Section 7 of the American Rivals of Sherlock Holmes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The American Rivals of Sherlock Holmes. Mystery of the Scarlet Thread by Jacques Futrelle, Part 2. 5. The thinking machine stared steadily into the eager, exultant eyes of the newspaperman until Hatch, at last, began to fear that he had been precipitate. After a while, under close scrutiny, the reporter began to feel convinced that he had made a mistake. He didn't quite see where, but it must be there, and the exultant manner passed. The voice of the thinking machine was like a cold shower. "Remember, Mr. Hatch," he said critically, "that unless every possible question has been considered, one cannot boast of a solution. Is there any possible question lingering yet in your mind?" The reporter silently considered that for a moment, then, "Well, I have the main facts anyway. There may be one or two minor questions left, but the principal ones are answered." "Then tell me, to the minutest detail, what you have learned, what has happened." Professor Van Dusen sank back in his old, familiar pose in the large armchair, and Hatch related what he had learned and what he surmised. He related, too, the peculiar circumstances surrounding the wounding of Henley, and right on down to the beginning and end of the interview with Cabell in the latter's apartments. The thinking machine was silent for a time. Then there came a host of questions. "Do you know where the woman, Miss Austen, is now?" was the first. "No," Hatch had to admit. "Or her precise mental condition?" "No." "Or her exact relationship to Cabell?" "No." "Do you know, then, what the valet, Jean, knows of the affair?" "No, not that," said the reporter, and his face flushed under the close questioning. He was out of the suite every night. "Therefore might have been the very one who turned on the gas," the other put in testily. "So far as I can learn, nobody could have gone into that room and turned on the gas," said the reporter somewhat aggressively. "Henley barred the doors and windows and kept watch night after night. Yet, the moment he was exhausted and fell asleep, the gas was turned on to kill him," said the thinking machine. "Thus, we see that he was watched more closely than he watched." "I see what you mean now," said Hatch after a long pause. "I should like to know what Henley and Cabell and the valet knew of the girl who was found dead," the thinking machine suggested. "Further, I should like to know if there was a good-sized mirror, not one set in a bureau or dresser, either in Henley's room or the apartments where the girl was found. Find out this for me and... never mind, I'll go with you." The scientist left the room. When he returned he wore his coat and hat. Hatch arose mechanically to follow. For a block or more they walked along, neither speaking. The thinking machine was the first to break the silence. "You believe Cabell is the man who attempted to kill Henley?" "Frankly, yes," replied the newspaperman. "Why?" "Because he had the motive, disappointed love." "How?" "I don't know," Hatch confessed. "The doors of the Henley suite were closed. I don't see how anybody passed them." "And the girl? Who killed her? How? Why?" Disconsolately, Hatch shook his head as he walked on. The thinking machine interpreted his silence aright. "Don't jump at any conclusions," he advised sharply. "You are confident Cabell was to blame for this, and he might have been, I don't know yet, but you can suggest nothing to show how he did it. I have told you before that imagination is half of logic." At last the lights of the big apartment house where Henley lived came in sight. Hatch shrugged his shoulders. He had grave doubts, based on what he knew, whether the thinking machine would be able to see Cabell. It was nearly 11 o'clock, and Cabell was to leave for the south at midnight. "Is Mr. Cabell here?" asked the scientist of the elevator boy. "Yes, just about to go, though. He won't see anyone." "Hand him this note," instructed the thinking machine, and he scribbled something on a piece of paper. "He'll see us." The boy took the paper, and the elevator shot up to the 4th floor. After a while he returned. "He'll see you," he said. "Is he unpacking?" "After he read your note twice, he told his valet to unpack," the boy replied. "Ah, I thought so," said the thinking machine. With Hatch, mystified and puzzled, following, the thinking machine entered the elevator to step out a second or so later on the 4th floor. As they left the car they saw the door of Cabell's apartment standing open. Cabell was in the door. Hatch traced a gleam of anxiety in the eyes of the young man. "Professor Van Dusen?" Cabell inquired. "Yes," said the scientist. "It was of the utmost importance that I should see you. Otherwise I shouldn't have come at this time of night." With a wave of his hand Cabell passed the detail. "I was anxious to get away at midnight," he explained. "But of course now I shan't go, in view of your note. I have ordered my valet to unpack my things, at least until tomorrow." The reporter and the scientist passed into the luxuriously furnished apartments. Jean, the valet, was bending over a suitcase as they entered, removing some things he had been carefully placing there. He didn't look back or pay the least attention to the visitors. "This is your valet?" asked the thinking machine. "Yes," said the young man. "French, isn't he?" "Yes." "Speak English at all?" "Very badly," said Cabell. "I use French when I talk to him." "Does he know that you are accused of murder?" asked the thinking machine in a quiet, conversational tone. The effect of the remark on Cabell was startling. He staggered back a step or so as if he had been struck in the face, and a crimson flush overspread his brow. Jean, the valet, straightened up suddenly and looked around. There was a queer expression, too, in his eyes, an expression which Hatch could not fathom. "Murder!" gasped Cabell at last. "Yes, he speaks English all right," remarked the thinking machine. "Now, Mr. Cabell, will you please tell me just who Miss Austen is, and where she is, and her mental condition? Believe me, it may save you a great deal of trouble. What I said in the note is not exaggerated." The young man turned suddenly, and began to pace back and forth across the room. After a few minutes he paused before the thinking machine, who stood impatiently waiting for an answer. "I'll tell you, yes," said Cabell firmly. "Miss Austen is a middle-aged woman whom my sister befriended several times, was in fact my sister's governess when she was a child. Of late years she has not been wholly right mentally, and has suffered a great deal of privation. I had about concluded arrangements to put her in a private sanitarium. I permitted her to remain in these rooms in my absence, south. I did not take Jean. He lived in the quarters of the other employees of the place, and gave the apartment entirely to Miss Austen. It was simply an act of charity." "What was the cause of your sudden determination to go south to-night?" asked the scientist. "I won't answer that question," was the sullen reply. There was a long, tense silence. Jean, the valet, came and went several times. "How long has Miss Austen known Mr. Henley?" "Presumably since she has been in these apartments," was the reply. "Are you sure you are not Miss Austen?" demanded the scientist. The question was almost staggering, not only to Cabell but to Hatch. Suddenly, with flaming face, the young Southerner leaped forward as if to strike down the thinking machine. "That won't do any good," said the scientist coldly. "Are you sure you're not Miss Austen?" he repeated. "Certainly I'm not Miss Austen," responded Cabell fiercely. "Have you a mirror in these apartments about 12 inches by 12 inches?" asked the thinking machine irrelevantly. I don't know," stammered the young man. Have we, Jean?" "Oui," replied the valet. "Yes," snapped the thinking machine. "Talk English, please. May I see it?" The valet, without a word, but with a silent glance at the questioner, turned and left the room. He returned after a moment with the mirror. The thinking machine carefully examined the frame, top and bottom, and on both sides. At last he looked up. Again the valet was bending over a suitcase. "Do you use gas in these apartments?" the scientist asked suddenly. "No," was the bewildered response. "What is all this, anyway?" Without answering, the thinking machine drew a chair up under the chandelier where the gas and electric fixtures were, and began to finger the gas tips. After a while he climbed down and passed into the next room, with Hatch and Cabell, both hopelessly mystified, following. There the scientist went through the same process of fingering the gas jets. Finally one of the gas tips came out in his hand. "Ah!" he exclaimed suddenly. Hatch knew the note of triumph in it. The jet from which the tip came was just on a level with his shoulder, set between a dressing table and a window. He leaned over and squinted at the gas pipe closely. Then he returned to the room where the valet was. "Now, Jean," he began in an even, calm voice, "please tell me if you did or did not kill Miss Renier purposely?" "I don't know what you mean," said the servant sullenly, angrily, as he turned on the scientist. "You speak very good English now," was the thinking machine's terse command. Mr. Hatch locked the door and used his phone to call the police. Hatch turned to do as he was bid and saw a flash of steel in young Cabell's hand, which was drawn suddenly from a hip pocket. It was a revolver. The weapon glittered in the light and Hatch flung himself forward. There was a sharp report and a bullet was buried in the floor. 6. Then came a fierce, hard fight for possession of the revolver. It ended with the weapon in Hatch's hand, and both he and Cabell blowing from the effort they had expended. Jean, the valet, had turned at the sound of the shot and started toward the door leading into the hall. The thinking machine had stepped in front of him and now stood there with his back to the door. Physically he would have been a child in the hands of the valet, yet there was a look in his eyes which stopped him. "Now, Mr. Hatch," said the scientist quietly, a touch of irony in his voice, "hand me the revolver, then phone for Detective Mallory to come here immediately. Tell him we have a murderer, and if he can't come at once, get some other detective whom you know." "Murderer!" gasped Cabell. Uncontrollable rage was blazing in the eyes of the valet, and he made as if to throw the thinking machine aside, despite the revolver, when Hatch was at the telephone. As Jean started forward, however, Cabell stopped him with a quick, stern gesture. Suddenly the young Southerner turned on the thinking machine, but it was with a question. "What does it all mean?" he asked, bewildered. "It means that the man there," and the thinking machine indicated the valet by a nod of his head, "is a murderer, that he killed Louise Renier, that he shot Weldon Henley on Boston Common, and that, with the aid of Miss Renier, he had 4 times previously attempted to kill Mr. Henley. Is he coming, Mr. Hatch?" "Yes," was the reply. "He says he'll be here directly." "Do you deny it?" demanded the thinking machine of the valet. "I've done nothing," said the valet sullenly. "I'm going out of here." Like an infuriated animal he rushed forward. Hatch and Cabell seized him and bore him to the floor. There, after a frantic struggle, he was bound, and the other 3 men sat down to wait for Detective Mallory. Cabell sank back in his chair with a perplexed frown on his face. From time to time he glanced at Jean. The flush of anger which had been on the valet's face was gone now. Instead there was a pallor of fear. "Won't you tell us?" pleaded Cabell impatiently. "When Detective Mallory comes and takes his prisoner," said the thinking machine. 10 minutes later they heard a quick step in the hall outside, and Hatch opened the door. Detective Mallory entered and looked from one to another inquiringly. "That's your prisoner, Mr. Mallory," said the scientist coldly. "I charge him with the murder of Miss Renier, whom you were so confident committed suicide. I charge him with 5 attempts on the life of Weldon Henley, 4 times by gas poisoning, in which Miss Renier was his accomplice, and once by shooting. He is the man who shot Mr. Henley." The thinking machine arose and walked over to the prostrate man, handing the revolver to Hatch. He glared down at Jean fiercely. "Will you tell how you did it, or shall I?" he demanded. His answer was a sullen, defiant glare. He turned and picked up the square mirror which the valet had produced previously. "That's where the screw was, isn't it?" he asked as he indicated a small hole in the frame of the mirror. Jean stared at it, and his head sank forward hopelessly. "And this is the bathrobe you wore, isn't it?" he demanded again, and from the suitcase he pulled out the garment with the scarlet stripe. "I guess you got me all right," was the sullen reply. "It might be better for you if you told the story then," suggested the thinking machine. "You know so much about it, tell it yourself." "Very well," was the calm rejoinder. "I will. If I make any mistake you will correct me." For a long time no one spoke. The thinking machine had dropped back into a chair and was staring through his thick glasses at the ceiling. His fingertips were pressed tightly together. At last he began. "There are certain trivial gaps which only the imagination can supply, until the matter is gone into more fully. I should have supplied these myself, but the arrest of this man Jean was precipitated by the attempted hurried departure of Mr. Cabell for the South tonight, and I did not have time to go into the case to the fullest extent. Thus we begin with the fact that there were several clever attempts made to murder Mr. Henley. This was by putting out the gas which he habitually left burning in his room. It happened 4 times in all, thus proving that it was an attempt to kill him. If it had been only once, it might have been an accident. Even twice, it might have been accident. But the same accident does not happen 4 times at the same time of night. Mr. Henley finally grew to regard the strange extinguishing of the gas as an effort to kill him, and carefully locked and barred his door and windows each night. He believed that someone came into his apartments and put out the light, leaving the gas flow. This, of course, was not true. Yet the gas was put out. How? My first idea, a natural one, was that it was turned off for an instant at the meter. When the light would go out, then turned on again. This, I convinced myself, was not true. Therefore, still the question, how? It is a fact. I don't know how widely known it is, but it is a fact that every gaslight in this house might be extinguished at the same time from this room without leaving it. How? Simply by removing the gas jet tip and blowing into the gas pipe. It would not leave a jet in the building burning. It is due to the fact that the lung power is greater than the pressure of the gas in the pipes and forces it out. Thus, we have the method employed to extinguish the light in Mr. Henley's rooms, and all the barred and locked doors and windows would not stop it. At the same time it threatened the life of every other person in the house, that is, every other person who used gas. It was probably for this reason that the attempt was always made late at night. I should say 3 or 4 o'clock. That's when it was done, isn't it? He asked suddenly of the valet. Staring at the thinking machine in open-mouthed astonishment, the valet noted his acquiescence, before he was fully aware of it. "Yes, that's right," the thinking machine resumed complacently. "This was easily found out, comparatively. The next question was how was a watch kept on Mr. Henley? It would have done no good to extinguish the gas before he was asleep, or to have turned it on when he was not in his rooms. It might have led to a speedy discovery of just how the thing was done. There's a spring lock on the door of Mr. Henley's apartment, therefore it would have been impossible for anyone to peer through the keyhole. There are no cracks through which one might see. How was this watch kept? How was the plotter to satisfy himself positively of the time when Mr. Henley was asleep? How was it that the gas was put out at no time of the score or more nights Mr. Henley himself kept watch? Obviously he was watched through a window. No one could climb out on the window ledge and look into Mr. Henley's apartments. No one could see into the apartment from the street. That is, could see whether Mr. Henley was asleep or even in bed. They could see the light. Watch was kept with the aid offered by the flagpole, supplemented with a mirror. This mirror. A screw was driven into the frame. It has been removed now. It was swung on the flagpole rope and pulled out to the end of the pole, facing the building. To a man standing in the hall window of the third floor, it offered precisely the angle necessary to reflect the interior of Mr. Henley's suite, possibly even showed him in bed through a narrow opening in the curtain. There is no shade on the windows of that suite. Heavy curtains instead. Is that right? Again the prisoner was surprised into a mute acquiescence. I saw the possibility of these things, and I saw, too, that at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning it would be perfectly possible for a person to move about the upper halls of this house without being seen. If he wore a heavy bathrobe, with a hood, say, no one would recognize him, even if he were seen, and besides the garb would not cause suspicion. This bathrobe has a hood. Now, in working the mirror back and forth on the flagpole at night, a tiny scarlet thread was pulled out of the rope and clung to the rope. I found this thread. Later, Mr. Hedge found an identical thread in these apartments. Both came from the bathrobe. Plain logic shows that the person who blew down the gas pipes worked the mirror trick. The person who worked the mirror trick left the thread. The thread comes back to the bathrobe. That bathrobe there, he pointed dramatically. Thus, the person who desired Henley's death was in these apartments, or had easy access to them. He paused for a moment, and there was tense silence. A great light was coming to Hedge, slowly but surely. The brain that had followed all this was unlimited in possibilities. Even before we traced the origin of the crime to this room, went on the scientist quietly now, attention had been attracted here, particularly to you, Mr. Cabell. You were through the love affair, of which Miss Lipscomb was the centre. Mr. Hedge learned that you and Henley had been rivals for her hand. It was that, even before his scarlet thread was found, which indicated that you might have some knowledge of the affair, directly or indirectly. You are not a malicious or revengeful man, Mr. Cabell, but you are hot-tempered, extremely so. You demonstrated that just now, when angry and not understanding, but feeling that your honor was at stake, you shot a hole in the floor. What? Asked Detective Mallory. A little accident, explained the thinking machine quickly. Not being a malicious or revengeful man, you're not the man to deliberately go ahead and make elaborate plans for the murder of Henley. In a moment of passion, you might have killed him, but never deliberately, as the result of premeditation. Besides, you were out of town. Who was then in these apartments? Who had access to these apartments? Who might have used your bathrobe? Your valet, possibly Miss Austen. Which? Now, let's see how we reach this conclusion, which led to the valet. Miss Renier was found dead. It was not suicide. How did I know? Because she had been reading with the gaslight at its full. If she had been reading by the gaslight, how was it then that it went out and suffocated her before she could arise and shut it off? Obviously, she must have fallen asleep over a book and left the light burning. If she was in the spot to kill Henley, why did she light the jet in her room? There might have been some defect in the electric bulb in her room, which she had just discovered. Therefore, she lighted the gas, intending to extinguish it, turn it off entirely, later. But she fell asleep. Therefore, when the valet here blew into the pipe, intending to kill Mr. Henley, he unwittingly killed the woman he loved, Miss Renier. It was perfectly possible, meanwhile, that she did not know of the attempt to be made that particular night, although she had participated in the others, knowing that Henley had night after night sat up to watch the light in his rooms. The facts, as I knew them, showed no connection between Miss Renier and this man at that time, nor any connection between Miss Renier and Henley. It might have been that the person who blew the gas out of the pipe from the rooms knew nothing whatever of Miss Renier, just as he didn't know who else he might have killed in the building. But I had her death and the manner of it. I had eliminated you, Mr. Cabell. Therefore, there remained Miss Austen and the valet. Miss Austen was eccentric, insane, if you will. Would she have any motive for killing Henley? I could imagine none. Love? Probably not. Money? They had nothing in common on that ground. What? Nothing that I could see. Therefore, for the moment, I passed Miss Austen by, after asking you, Mr. Cabell, if you were Miss Austen. What remained? The valet. Motive? Several possible ones, one or two probable. He is French, or says he is. Miss Renier is French. Therefore, I had arrived at the conclusion that they knew each other as people of the same nationality will in a house of this sort. And remember, I had passed by Mr. Cabell and Miss Austen, so the valet was the only one left. He could use the bathrobe. Well, the motive. Frankly, that was the only difficult point in the entire problem. Difficult because there were so many possibilities, and each possibility that suggested itself suggested also a woman. Jealousy? There must be a woman. Hate? Probably a woman. Attempted extortion? With the aid of a woman. No other motive which would lead to so elaborate a plot of murder would come forward. Who was the woman? Miss Renier. Did Miss Renier know Henley? Mr. Hatch had reason to believe he knew her because of his actions when informed of her death. Knew her how? People of such relatively different planes of life can know each other, or do know each other, only on one plane. Henley is a typical young man, fast, I dare say, and liberal. Perhaps then there had been a liaison. When I saw this possibility, I had my motives, all of them. Jealousy, hate, and possibly attempted extortion as well. What was more possible than Mr. Henley and Miss Renier had been acquainted? All liaisons are secret ones. Suppose she had been cast off because of the engagement to a young woman of Henley's own level? Suppose she had confided in the valet here? Do you see? Motives enough for any crime, however diabolical. The attempt on Henley's life possibly followed an attempted extortion of money. The shot which wounded Henley was fired by this man, Jean. Why? Because the woman who had cause to hate Henley was dead. Then the man? He was alive and vindictive. Henley knew who shot him, and knew why, but he'll never say it publicly. He can't afford to. It would ruin him. I think probably that's all. Do you want to add anything? He asked the valet. No, was the fierce reply. I'm sorry I didn't kill him, that's all. It was all about as you said, though. God knows how you found it out, he added desperately. Are you a Frenchman? I was born in New York, but lived in France for 11 years. I first knew Louisa there. Silence fell upon the little group. Then Hatch asked a question. You told me, Professor, that there would be no other attempt to kill Henley by extinguishing the gas. How did you know that? Because one person, the wrong person, had been killed that way, was the reply. For this reason it was hardly likely that another attempt of that sort would be made. You had no intention of killing Louisa Renier, had you, Jean? No. God help me, no. It was all done in these apartments, the thinking machine added, turning to Cabell, at the gas jet from which I took the tip. It had been only loosely replaced, and the metal was tarnished where the lips had dampened it. It must take great lung power to do a thing like that, remarked Detective Mallory. You would be amazed to know how easily it is done, said the scientist. Try it some time. The thinking machine arose and picked up his hat. Hatch did the same. Then the reporter turned to Cabell. Would you mind telling me why you were so anxious to get away tonight? He asked. Well, no, Cabell explained, and there was a rush of red to his face. It's because I received a telegram from Virginia, Miss Lipscomb, in fact. Some of Henley's past had come to her knowledge, and the telegram told me that the engagement was broken. On top of this came the information that Henley had been shot, and I was considerably agitated. The thinking machine and Hatch were walking along the street. What did you write in the note you sent to Cabell that made him start to unpack? Asked the reporter curiously. There are some things that it wouldn't be well for everyone to know, was the enigmatic response. Perhaps it would be just as well for you to overlook this little omission. Of course, replied the reporter, wonderingly. End of section 7, The Scarlet Thread, by Jacques Futrelle, Part 2. Recording by Julie Niedermeyer.